Hi, everyone. I'm going to introduce myself very briefly. I'm Martine Maron. I am over in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and I work on birds, although I recently have been sort of masquerading as a policy type, doing a lot of really stressful and depressing, mostly, work on things like biodiversity offsetting. And I'm not going to talk about that today. Some of the things I'm going to talk about today are still a little bit stressful and depressing, but mostly that's tempered by the fact that there are pictures of gorgeous birds on several of the slides. So that is good news. It's always really hard when you're giving a talk about like biodiversity offsetting and environmental regulation to make your talk look visually interesting, as you can imagine. So I'm really happy to be talking about the stuff that I first got interested in. Well, actually, I think I was born interested in birds. I don't know how this happens, but particularly interested in bird community ecology back from when I was doing my PhD, which was a really long time ago, and I'm not even going to say how long because it's too depressing to mention. But the weird thing is that this isn't working. The weird thing is that I'm actually going to start by talking about mammals because, and this is, by the way, I should say, this is sort of a talk that I put together for the International Ornithological Congress. So there's some stuff that's probably a bit too general for this room that I'm going to go through a bit faster. But I wanted to sort of contextualize where Australia is at in terms of our environmental performance for an international audience and, own up to the fact that we are absolutely infamous as a nation for sending stuff extinct, and especially mammals. And this is, this is obviously a terrible, terrible thing. But it's not just the extinctions of these mammals, like the complete loss of this mammal from every corner of the continent, that's the problem. Because, so if you look at these are maps of where they used to occur and then where they currently occur in the dark orange. We actually see this syndrome that's just as impactful, where we've lost a lot of species from a lot of the continent. Even if they aren't completely extinct yet, they're functionally extinct from most of the places where they once occurred. And this is really important because these critters used to do across all these areas really important things. They turned over soil, improved the soil structure, dispersed, fungi that plants need to survive, and all this sort of stuff. So even the parts of the mammalian fauna that aren't completely extinct are really, really depauperate. And because of the extinctions, we can actually never fix that in Australia. But as for birds on the mainland, at least in Australia, we aren't doing as badly. So we've actually only officially recorded a single mainland species extinction, the paradise parrot, which used to occur not that far from here out west through Queensland, and it was lost through habitat transformation, essentially. So, this sort of gives us a little bit of hope because we still have time to actually save the full contingent of bird species, almost, that occurred in Australia. So while we've lost all of the important functions that those mammals used to perform, we have the potential still. We have the species still existing somewhere in Australia to a large extent to be able to repair our avifaunas. Of course, it's going to be really hard because we do still have that same problem of local extirpations that's really widespread, and it has led to enormous declines in many, many species. So 38 species and 216 distinct taxa of birds are nationally threatened with extinction. And so there was this really fantastic piece of work edited by Stephen Garnett and Barry Baker, which was the action plan for Australian birds, the 2020 version. Probably many people in this room contributed to the data that are collated there that really summarise the state of play and just how enormous the task is. There were some successes in this book, that there had been some improvements since the last action plan, but that was mainly for island species where there'd been able to be interventions around management of introduced species. Mainland birds, on the whole, are going downhill. So we're still losing mainland birds. And so this is a piece of work that was done by Michelle Wood, which really maps out those local losses. So, aside from complete continental extinctions, where are the parts of Australia that have lost these birds, even if they still occur somewhere else? And you can sort of see basically the number of species, and this is just threatened taxa in Australia. Of those threatened taxa, which places have they been lost from? And it's basically shaded, the warmer, the more red the shade, the more species have been lost from those parts of the continent. So this was work that Michelle did that really brought together, you know, a huge amount of information from sort of historical data sources and expert elicitation and scientific literature to map the historical extent of 72 of the most threatened birds in Australia and compared that with their current distribution. And basically found that I think, oh, sorry, I'm just trying to get the actual stats up so I don't tell you any lies. So 78% of terrestrial threatened birds are gone from at least half of their range. So that's a really big loss, even if they never do go extinct, you know, that's still a huge impact across large parts of their range. And it's not surprising. So if we go back to Michelle's map again, so you can see that there is a concentration of these areas of multiple extirpations of threatened birds in the southeast. And it's not really surprising why. So if you look at this map of original vegetation cover in Australia, essentially the green, the dark and light green, the forests and woodlands are the areas where we've also seen the most clearing, obviously. So it's really unsurprising. A lot of that is simply being driven by the fact there is no habitat yet left there for them to inhabit. And I think that the story is told even more eloquently, perhaps, the story of this land clearing and its impact by looking not just at the threatened species, but all the species. And this is work that's been led by Jeremy over there, who could explain it much better. So ask him later on if you have any questions. Every one of these coloured pixels on this map, stop me if I'm telling it wrong, Jeremy. Every one of these coloured pixels on this map is a place where habitat has been lost. And the redder it is, the more species would once have lived there. So with every one of these hectares of clearing, up to 180 species lost some of their potential habitat, basically. So with every one of these cuts, it's not just, was there a threatened species that lived there? Think of all the other hundreds, and this is just birds that have gone from those areas. So the part of Australia where we're standing right now, you know, a hectare of loss around us means a hectare less habitat for, you know, over 150 different species of birds. So this is a story of loss, particularly in that woodland zone of Australia, particularly in the southeast and the southwest. That's been talked about for a really long time amongst birdie folk. And certainly back in the 90s, there were you know, a lot of really seminal pieces of work done by people like Harry Recker and Jeff Barrett and Julian Reed and Hugh Ford, who were really chronicling the decline of the common birds, the losses of the birds that aren't yet threatened, that were probably never going to trigger the threshold for being a nationally threatened species. They might be really widespread, but in so many parts of Australia, and especially in places where people live, they're disappearing. They're just sort of popping out of existence from patch after patch of remaining vegetation. So we're seeing these ongoing extirpations, but these birds, you know, things like speckled warblers, rufous whistlers, red-capped robins, yellow thornbills, these are quite widespread birds. They're never going to trigger any threshold for individual attention. You know, these are things that are just never going to get that high conservation priority, that sort of response. So, for example, a habitat that supports them is not going to get the same level of protection. There needs to be something else. We're always looking for triggers. Well, what's the threatened species? Is it a threatened ecological community? If it's just a place like this bull oak woodland here, well, it happens that bull oak woodlands are actually a threatened ecological community. But this particular bull oak woodland, look at the ground layer. It's just weeds. It's trees and weeds. So actually, it doesn't necessarily meet the threshold to even be considered an example of an ecological community, right? If it, you know, under the EPBC Act, for example, if it was being assessed for clearing. But it's full of all these birds. It's absolutely awesome for this co-occurrence of all these little guys that hang out together. But that's not going to be recognised in the sort of frameworks that we have at the moment. And so that's. Is it not on? Oh, goodness.
We can't see you. Guys. We can hear you well.
Thank you for letting me know. I didn't know it wasn't on. So yeah, this is basically the phenomenon that I was sort of going to talk about today, was the fact that threatened species lists, they don't tell the whole story, or even most of the story of biodiversity loss, of ecosystem erosion anywhere, and certainly in Australia. This is a real syndrome of a whole community that is essentially unraveling through all of these little individual local extirpations of many species, particularly in this case, in the woodland zone, smaller bodied songbirds, smaller bodied passerine birds. And that's leaving behind this avifauna that's really shifted, really dominated by larger birds, parrots, carnivores, and things like that. So the work that many of those in my group have been working on over the years has started to focus on understanding the woodland bird community as a whole, like as a distinct and recognizable entity in and of itself, that itself is under threat as a community. Because conservation isn't surely just about making sure that every individual of every species, that every species has at least one individual or a pair remaining somewhere on the planet. That's not what it's meant to be about. It should be about making sure that ecosystems everywhere, still support and are supported by the full gamut of the species that constitute them. It's too late for us to do that with Australia's mammal community because so many of them are gone forever, completely extinct. And it's not too late for us to do that with our birds. We can still keep and recover our birds. Didn't like that. Oh, that's right. I had a little sound thing. How do I play the sound thing? So it's just like a recording of the sort of sounds that you should hear in a really healthy, intact example of this community. Little musical, tweeting sort of things, and less of the sort of really loud, raucous stuff that those bigger birds do, So that was a good example. Right. So what's the pathway for better recognition of this problem of faunal communities as being distinct things? Because we have got the tools in place. We just need to think a little bit differently about how we use them. So we're thinking about this idea of defining entire faunal communities as entities requiring protection, as sort of ecological communities. And it's a process that's established over the last few years. The IUCN Red List of Ecosystems has become really well established. And Australia, for a long time, has listed eligible ecological communities as threatened ecological communities in the Act. But in both cases, almost every one of the communities that is currently being sort of assessed and listed is described and largely defined based on its plants, based on the plant community. And I'm sure if you're thinking about threatened ecological communities, that's the sort of thing you're thinking about. You might be thinking about that bull oak woodland, you might be thinking about the brigalow, you might be thinking about the semi-evergreen vine thickets or something like that. And that's what we tend to think about. And, we know there's a lot of fauna obviously associated with those communities, but they're not really the defining factor that we talk about. And, it's really important to focus on that because, as Kent Redford wrote in this seminal paper, we must not let a forest full of trees fool us into believing all is well. We know that threatened communities are not just plants. A loss of a functioning faunal community can actually occur well before a change becomes evident in a plant community. And also we know that the change in the faunal community can drive the decline of plant communities. And so we can't just assume that the structure of the habitat tells us everything we need to know about whether the faunal communities are healthy. And in the case of Australia's woodland birds, we really know we can all probably think of examples that are really structurally intact, but really depauperate. And the mammal extirpations gives us a really good example of that, of course. So structurally intact, but with a really simplified, transformed bird community. And also, the flip side is that sometimes apparently really degraded sites can be really important. So I just came back from a couple of days up in Darwin. I don't know how many people have heard about the proposal at Lee Point for defence housing development in some of this habitat. If you're a birder, you probably have, because after the approval has come through, about 150 Gouldian finches, an endangered species, have turned up on this site. So I was really interested to go and see it. And it's amazing. It's full of birders and there's 10 different species of finches that they're seeing anyway. And it's full of gamba grass. and which is a terrible environmental weed in the Northern Territory, and the Gullians are feeding on the camber grass. Anyway, so this is an example of a site that you would go to, do an environmental assessment of, think, well, it's a bit trashed, and yet it's actually, you know, absolutely jumping with, you know, cool things, starfinches, all sorts of stuff. It's awesome. Anyway, so I embarrassed Jeremy again. So this was some work that we did with Hannah Fraser and Alex Carr a few years ago to try to formalize this definition. So if you're going to assess an entity for listing, you actually have to have a really repeatable definition of what it is that everyone agrees on. And so this was work that was contributed to by a huge number of different experts. And our working hypothesis was that if we brought a whole lot of woodland bird experts together from across Australia, we'd probably be able to come up with a common definition of what counts as a woodland bird community. So we just had to work out how to do that in a replicable way and a way to measure the relative condition. So we drew things from the brains of about 70 different people across Australia, familiar with different examples of the woodland bird community. These are some illustrations that Zoe Stone helped me with, but you know, we really found that even though whether we were in southeastern Australia or in Tasmanian woodlands or in the southwest of West Australia, there was a similar functional and taxonomic profile of birds that you would expect to find in a really intact example of a woodland bird community. So right from, you know, many small-bodied birds, insectivores, you'd have a fairy wren, you'd have some sort of a robin, you'd have some bark gleaners, you'd have foliage gleaners. You know, there's this particular profile that you'd expect. Now, the species might be different, but the roles that they're fulfilling are actually pretty similar. So that was great. That meant we could actually get a consensus definition of these bird communities. And we were able to sort of identify different subregions as well. So where you actually had those taxonomic sort of substitutions from one type of tree creeper to another, one type of robin to another, that sort of thing. So that was really useful. And then we were able to develop a rough community condition index for this community, because one of the important criteria for whether a community is threatened is whether it has declined in condition. So what is condition when we're talking about birds? Well, there is no answer, like there is no official correct answer to what is the condition of anything. That's always an expert judgment. So we used expert elicitation to identify the relative condition of sites based on 2 hectare, 20-minute lists, and then worked out what characteristics of those lists best explained the expert judgment of condition. And that meant we were able to actually then calculate that condition for all the lists that have been submitted in the 2 sort of BirdLife, the early BirdLife Atlas around 70s and early 80s, and compare that with the one that started in the 90s and continues as bird data today, and look at the changes in extent and condition. I'm not really going to go into the specifics of it all, but suffice to say we essentially were able with this information then to look at 5 of the 6 different potential criteria under which a community could be listed as threatened under the EPBC Act, and concluded that all of those 6 subvariants in the different sort of parts of the woodland zone would meet at least one criterion for being critically endangered, in our opinion. So that's been nominated through the process. It has been considered year after year. I don't know how many years are we up to now, Jeremy, like 6, 7 years on. It's a bit depressing. Anyway, but they're not saying, no, we're not going to do it. They're just saying we don't have enough resources and we want to do it, but maybe next year. So we're just going to keep trying to get it listed. Okay, so very quickly, this is a high-level overview of threats you all know. So the question, of course, is, well, you know, that's all very well and good, but what's happening and what can we do about it? Obviously, a really large part of this is, as I was showing those figures before, if there's no habitat left, they can't be there. This community can't exist. And we're continuing to clear habitat at a really high rate. I could have a whole other talk on this topic, but I'm not going to. Suffice to say that land clearing has not slowed down. It's in fact increased in the last 2 years for which we have data that aren't on that graph yet. Part of that increase is because of a change in methodology. Part of it is real. And the change in methodology part sort of suggests we've been underestimating clearing in the past sort of 20-year time series here. So obviously the habitat goes, that's bad. But when I moved to Queensland after working in Victoria, I was really surprised because there's some great big areas of contiguous woodland, you know, in inland Queensland that I was really excited to go and see wow, I've worked in these really fragmented systems. I expect these things are going to be totally jumping with birds. And they weren't, you know, these are really degraded systems. The majority of what you see when you look at the remnant vegetation in Queensland is places that are degraded by grazing in particular. And the grazing is behind so much of this because there's so many different mechanisms through which grazing has impacts on habitat. So obviously, you know, it opens out the ground layer, removes lower vegetation cover, and also to support grazing, new and different forms of buffel grass have been introduced by the pastoral industry that can really invade in even under quite dense canopy. And that in turn, then apart from changing the structure of the ground layer, it also carries fire into systems. And those fires in turn open out the structure of those systems. So we've got a removal of vegetation at lower levels, more severe, more frequent fires that are causing more simplification of vegetation systems. And all of this is really great for one species, the noisy miner. So there's this whole syndrome of things going on, each of them on their own, bad for woodland birds, but the ultimate problem is that they really cause their arch enemy, the noisy miner, to be very, very happy indeed. Now, I don't know if you're not familiar with these guys. I mean, you are, because, you know, you walk out the door and you'll probably be hassled for your sugar packet at the cafe by one. But this is an amazing species that has a really complex social structure that was first described by the late Doug Dow in the late 70s out in the Lockyer Valley, in a site which sadly doesn't exist anymore. But they have this incredible hierarchical social structure where you have great big sort of, you know, colonies that are formed of groups of birds which fight. The groups fight one another unless there's a really big threat, and then they gang up and they'll fight that threat together. But apart from fighting one another, which they just spend a lot of their time doing, they also fight basically anything else that turns up. They'll chase almost any other species, not just birds, but gee, they really do have a go at every bird. And essentially, if the bird is smaller than them, then they win. So it's just a typical bully. Well, they're not a typical bully because they pick on those larger than them as well. But if it's a smaller bird, they chase it away. And so this is the sort of multifaceted problem we're dealing with here. They love structural simplification. Noisy miners love a nice open understory. They like a really grazed ground layer, and they like spaced out trees. So if they can't get that, then they like the edges of denser vegetation where there's cleared land adjacent. So, you know, people talk about them as an edge species. They can be an edge species in denser vegetation, but actually they just like suitable habitat. So they are as far away from an edge as you can possibly get if it's a nice open woodland. And this goes back to my point before about you can have, like, some woodlands are meant to be like that, lovely open grassy woodlands, but those sorts of woodlands tend to be absolutely dominated by noisy miners. It might look like a lovely example of a grassy woodland, but the avifauna can be really depauperate. We also know that noisy miners are increasing. Well, this is actually a bit old, this work now, so it would be interesting to update it. But basically all of the darker greys are the bioregions in which noisy miners were increasing, and increasing really rapidly. And this is data between, I think, 1998 and 2014. And so, you know, a lot of that was through quite a dry period. And noisy miners seem to love that. They seem to take the opportunity to expand. And I would imagine that's partly because, you know, dry periods, the vegetation density does tend to naturally thin out, and that suits noisy miners. There's easier for them to invade. So because of these behaviours and their increase, and, you know, the fact that this is an impact, this is a threat that anybody can observe. People see it in their backyard. So it's not like some hypothetical distant threat that you've got to read a scientific paper about to understand. You can just go and see it happening. And they've been called a lot of rude words. So they've been called overabundant, despotic, hyper-aggressive, reverse keystones, which I think is a very evocative one, bullies, and the enemy. And so, you know, there's a lot of work describing this problem. And to give you a bit more of a picture, so these are essentially the modelled effects of noisy miner density on the proportion of the birds at a site that are small passerine birds. So you can see that when you don't have noisy miners, chances are your woodland site if you do a survey in a woodland site, it's going to be dominated. Most of the birds, up to 80% of the birds, are going to be small-bodied woodland birds. It doesn't take many miners to have that drop down to hardly any, so it's a huge and rapid shift. And every one of these coloured lines is just from a different one of those black blocks. So this is a phenomenon that's really consistent right across Eastern Australia. And, it has all these flow-on effects. So this is what happens to the richness of small birds. The black line, all species combined, and then the coloured lines are just different foraging guilds. So, it's sort of across the board in terms of the foraging guilds, impact on foraging guilds. Whoops. Species abundance distributions really shift. So the ordered little black squares here are just species average abundance in sites without noisy miners, and then the open squares, which are usually a long way below the black squares, is the species average abundance in sites with noisy miners. So you get this real flattening out of species abundance distributions, with the exception of a huge spike in one species, noisy miners themselves. And as you can imagine, it also really shifts the foraging profile in these systems. So small insectivores decline, large insectivores and carnivores increase, and vertebrate predators, so butcher birds, currawongs, things like that become, so it's not just that the small birds fall away, but it's that these other birds, which are really important nest predators, they actively increase. They are, some of them, the butcher birds in particular, are sort of in cahoots with noisy miners. Okay, so the good thing is, of course, this is recognised now as a key threatening process under New South Wales and Victorian and under the EPBC Act. So we understand this is a problem. I mean, I actually don't think that the general community understanding of this problem is as great as it ought to be. If you start talking about this in your average group, people say, well, what about common miners? They'll bring up other things. And it's a surprise that the native bird is the one that's causing all these problems. We know the problem exists, though, at least at one level, but we're basically not doing anything much about it. This is the problem. So what are our actual options? And this is where I think it's really important to focus now if we're going to help this community. Well, one thing is we could stop putting new edges in. That's probably a really important thing. And ideas about opening up previously uncleared areas, this is one of the risks that needs to be considered. Hypothetically, you could just put back a lot of dense vegetation that they don't like. Pretty expensive, pretty difficult, but in some cases, maybe. Long unburnt patches that tend to be more structurally complex, these are becoming rarer and rarer in a lot of landscapes, and protecting those is really important. Should be a focus of fire management. No, I don't want you to do that. Reducing grazing can help. And replanting with non-eucalypt species is another one. They really like eucalypts. The reason they really like eucalypts is that eucalypts tend to have a lot of psyllid insects that create sugary lerp secretions. These guys are unusual for honeyeaters because they're sedentary. Mostly honeyeaters have to wander about to find, because they have a reasonable part of their diet, which is carbohydrates. So they've got to find where the nectar is, but these guys don't. They sit there, defend their territory. So they need year-round carbohydrate resources, and that has to be lerp. If you go with something like a cypress pine or a casuarina or something, it doesn't tend to have, it doesn't really have a blade-shaped leaf, so it doesn't tend to carry much psyllid or lerp. So they don't tend to occur in those sorts of systems. So obviously, again, limited. So there's a lot of options there. They've all got issues with them, at least in some places. Many of them are very expensive. What about just shooting them? Should we just cull this native bird? And so this is some work that we've done quite a few experiments on by now. It's quite interesting. There were some early pieces of work in the 90s led by Marilyn Gray that actually suggested that this is actually a really effective intervention. So Marilyn looked at a series of patches of woodland in Victoria from which noisy miners were shot. The colony that lived there was removed, was killed. And I remember talking to her 15 years later, and she said she'd been back, they're still gone. Now that's just weird. We can't achieve that with any other pest species. Thank you. And so there've been quite a few of these studies that seem to be showing positive results. And it's actually quite cost effective because they're quite easy to shoot. Maybe it takes a day and a half of effort for, a 50-hectare site. if that's all you have to do, even if you only have to do that every few years, that's actually really cost effective. I used to think, well, this is crazy. We can't go out shooting all these birds across all this area. But actually, if you compare it with, I don't know, planting back a structurally complex ground layer over the same area, it's actually probably more cost effective if it works. How did I get a blue squiggle? Did I do that? I don't know how I did that. Okay, what's happening? Okay, but then there were some other things that didn't turn out so promising. Culls that have been trialled that seemed to report very negative results. One of them I was involved with. So Galen Davitt was an honours student working here at UQ. And this was work that was part of a bigger study led by Paul McDonald and Richard Major, and Kim Monte was part of it as well. We actually set out, I really don't know how to get rid of the blue squiggle. We actually set out to try to work out, okay, well, it seems there's equivocal responses. Maybe what we need to be doing is like upscale the culling from just a couple of hectares to something bigger. And maybe that will be more effective. Let's try and work out what are the factors that affect the effectiveness of these culls. Like maybe if you've got more noisy miners or more vegetation in the surrounding landscape or less, or maybe one of these things will help. So we designed this experiment. We had 24 sites, about 30 to 40 hectares each in a couple of parts of New South Wales, and had randomly assigned control and treatment sites. So half of them involved culls, and they were really intensive culls. So this is one of the sites, and every one of those yellow tags is a bird that was removed during one cull. Like these are really, really densely occurring colonies, these noisy miners. So these are results that haven't been published yet. Some of them have been published, but some of them haven't. So the first part is what we published with Galen Davitt immediately after the cull. So we did surveys in all of these sites in the 2 weeks before the cull, in the 2 weeks after the cull, and well, I'll get to it. And that's what we found for noisy miners, right? So what the hell is going on? We just took out hundreds and hundreds of thousands of birds across all these sites, and there's the same number of them 2 weeks later. How is that possible, right? It is such a bizarre result. And we just thought, oh, well, this massive experiment that, well, okay, it's massive given the intervention, that we really, we really were actually interested in what affected, how effective it was. This is how they all turned out. They all seemed to be ineffective and just ineffective in terms of even reducing the numbers of noisy miners, which seems quite baffling. There were just that many in the landscape that they could all flood back in within days, within weeks. So we thought, oh, that's no good. So instead of giving up totally though, because we didn't really want all this work to be in vain and didn't really want the, you know, the culling to have occurred without trying to get something out of it, we thought we'll do one more repeat cull because that might be important. So after the second cull, we went back and took out the same number of birds again from all the sites. And I'll say we, I obviously didn't do it, but trained shooters did it. And still no difference between control and treatment sites from which the birds were removed. Absolutely baffling. But anyway, we thought, well, we may as well go and look at what happened to the small birds because that's what we're actually wanting to benefit. The weird thing is it did help the small birds. So this is what happened after the second cull. The sites from which noisy miners were removed actually had a significant increase in species richness, and density was even bigger. So this is a phenomenon you'd never see in nature because, you know, in a natural noisy miner colony, they've excluded these small birds. In these weird reconstituted colonies, it's different. They have not got their shit together and they are not apparently as effectively able to chase out the small birds. So that was really interesting. But we thought, okay, but that'll probably be it. Like presumably they will reconstitute, sort out their social interactions. This will be a short-lived effect. So this was like, you know, only a few weeks after the cull. But we went back after, I think this was after a year, out to a year. And this is what happened. We didn't do another cull, but the noisy miners actually dropped away in those sites. It was almost like they flooded back in, tried to sort themselves out, couldn't. Some of the colonies completely disappeared after this. And we didn't do any further intervention. So there's this lagged response, it seemed, to the removal. And the effect for small birds was also maintained over time as well. So that was really strange and unexpected. And this is work that if you're interested in this, because I know I've run out of time, read this article by Courtney Melton, who many of you will know, which is a fantastic summary where she reanalyzed all the results from our removals and from all of the removals she could get data from to try to identify, well, what seems to be the recipe? Why does some culls seem to be effective, some culls not seem to be effective? Spoiler, the answer is we still don't know. It seems really idiosyncratic, but she did find that that latent response seems to come up a lot. So regardless of whether authors were saying that the culls were effective or ineffective, actually in most cases, small birds increased, even if noisy miners didn't decrease. Okay, so I'm going to finish up because I've run out of time, but I did want to say one more thing very quickly, because I'm hoping that people who are working on bird community stuff will be able to help me, or even just know stuff about bird communities. So Carlina is leading a really cool piece of work, which is trying to replicate that work that we did with the woodland bird community for all the terrestrial bird communities of Australia. So that means we have to define, I have a list of all the things we have to do, and I'm going to skip through this because we don't have time. We have to define all the different bird communities in Australia, have a description based on a series of attributes, work out what the benchmark values for those attributes are, or at least understand the scaling of from a reference example or a best on offer example, right through to a degraded example. For that, we're going to need experts. We're going to need to elicit things from your brains and the brains of many other experts as well. So, and ultimately develop a method that calculates the condition of the bird community at a site based on a series of samples, basically standard survey lists. And so we're running a workshop at the ESA. So if anyone's going to the ESA and wants to come along to that workshop, let us know. We're going to talk a bit about the regionalisation that Carlene has been working on to try to work out, okay, well, what are the key bird communities in Australia, which is actually just super fun in and of itself. And then second, how are we going to measure whether an example of them is in good or poor condition. And I'm going to leave it there because I do not have enough time, except to say it's not too late for us to restore our woodland bird communities, but we need to invest a lot more in doing it. Thank you. Sorry, Kat.